The Games Workshop's given us a fairly big preview as to the new Leagues of Votann units today. Seems that Mr. Buri Aegnirssen has an immense melee profile. The techie weapon of the Arkanyst Evaluator can obliterate medium infantry, and a split datasheet for the Ironkin Steeljacks means that you could field loads of them. Let's talk about what we've got. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where Games Workshop have been keeping the Leagues of Votann previews coming this week. Yesterday we had the core army rule and some flavour of their detachments, and today we've got an article filling in a whole bunch of gaps and questions about the new units that they're getting. All of this comes on the back of the big 40k release wave this week. 6 new kits for the Leagues of Votann, plus their codex and combat patrol, plus some salamanders things for Volkenhestan, another combat patrol and dice there, and a couple of 40k individual releases for Slaughterbound and the Lord of Poxes. As ever, if you were looking to pick up some of these, feel free to check out the channel's discount retailers linked down in the video description. They can save a bit of money on any purchases of new shiny space dwarves. And here are the times for roughly when they go live around the world, between Friday nights to Saturday morning. Hopefully supply of these should be fairly good this time around, though obviously individual retailers might run out of any one thing. Let's jump into some rules for the kin though, and it seems that we've got at least some sort of reveal for every single one of the new units, maybe some of them telling us just a little bit more than others. Perhaps one of the bigger and more headline previews is Mr. Buri Aegnirssen, the rather cool looking heavily bionic Leagues of Votann kin, sporting lots of gilded finery, a great big dark star glaive, and the remnants of a slain tyrannid on his back. From the previous previews we already knew that he'd be operating as a lone operative character, so going it alone, and likely being a big melee threat, and he revives on death on a 2+ as well, which is really quite a powerful rule for lone operatives given that they're kind of hard to get damage on in the first place. So a pretty reasonable chance enemies might be able to nose just inside the range to damage him, take him down a peg, and then he comes back fighting. From the reveals today, it looks like they've given us his melee stat line, and while I think everyone was expecting it to be pretty intimidating, it's perhaps a particularly punchy one for an infantry character. He gets 5 attacks at strength 12, AP 3, and damage 3 with that huge relic glaive. In particular, the strength is massively higher than a bunch of other characters out there. I feel like I see a lot of other elite melee characters more sort of having profiles in the 6 to 10 kind of mark, maybe making up some of the difference with things like lethal hits or anti-keywords. It looks like they're just going for raw strength here. He'll be wounding things like Imperial Knights and Chaos Knights on a 3+. Those attacks also get precision as well, which means he wouldn't need to spend a command point on Epic Challenge if he wants to try and punch a character out of a unit. And he also has a sweep profile too, 10 attacks hitting on a 2+, a strength 6, AP 2 and damage 1 if he does need to clear some hordes. That feels like really quite a big win for him. Though I've no doubt with that massive great big hitting profile plus his lone operative and special rules, he's probably going to be expensive. Talking about his special rules, we already knew his Revive on Death 2+1, which they said from this article meant that he got up completely unscathed, so that implies he comes back at 4 wounds remaining. But the second one that we didn't know about basically looks like it's a Blood Surge move. When he gets shot and loses at least 1 wound to enemy attacks, he makes a d6 plus 2 inches directly closest to the closest enemy unit, and he can use that to move into engagement range. He can't do it when battle shocked, already in engagement range, and as normal he ignores aircraft for that purpose. Combined with Lone Operative and the Revive in Death, that just means that he's going to be a fairly fantastically hard character to approach without facing him in melee. It means that if you want to shoot him down, you basically need to park your unit, ideally somewhere that's greater than 9 inches away but less than 12 inches away. Fire with enough force to bring him down, but then there's a pretty reasonable chance he just gets back up and charges you anyway. It certainly could be a rule that might discourage people from firing in a few incidental shots before charging him with something as well, as if he jumps into combat with you rather than the other way round, unless you've got something else to countercharge him with. It means that he'll often have the opportunity to activate first with the normal sequence of attacks. Overall, he really is looking pretty excellent so far. Obviously we need to know points, his movement stats and his defensive stats still. Unless he's fantastically costly on the points department though, it really does look like he's going to be an interesting character, probably having a similar sort of feel and threats to things like Blood Angel's Mephiston or Lucius the Eternal for the Emperor's Children. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Baron of Dice. They're a high quality dice maker based in the USA. They made some fancy dice for the channel and asked to sponsor some videos at the time. Basically their thing is to have a vast range of different dice available that could represent different wargaming factions out there. They've got plenty of suitably dwarven ones that could be a good stand-in for the kin, though they work pretty nicely for fantasy dwarfs as well of course. They've got absolutely loads more beyond that though, loads of designs that could cover just about any army or faction that you could think of from Warhammer 40k or beyond, most of them with the options for squared or rounded corners. Their typical offering usually has 25 dice in a set. Usual prices tend to be around about £28 or $35, shipping out for the USA. If you do happen to pick anything up through them though, there is a code Auspex as well for 5% off any order, so be sure to use that if you do pick anything up from them. In any case, there'll be links down in the video description. I'll also leave a link to the very nice channel merchandise that they made with the channel logo in as well. I was certainly pleased with the feel and detailing on them. But in any case, a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. Moving on to the other Votann unit previews though, next up we have the Arkanyst Evaluator. This one's the unusual Leagues of Votann mad scientist guy, and definitely felt like he had the potential for some really interesting rules, basically having a lone operative protection when he's placed near friendly infantry units, and then not really seeming to have any sort of buffing effects they told us about. So it basically meant that he'd be balanced around just having his pure damage output, and could be pretty interesting for some scary firepower from the Transmatter Inverter. And whenever you can have a unit that can potentially shoot the enemy really quite hard but not get shot back so easily, that could generally be in for a good time. I'm glad they chose to reveal the profile of the gun, as I think that's what most people were most interested in. And it seems that it's got 3 different fire modes, so it's maybe a little bit different to what I was expecting. I was probably guessing that they'd have an anti-infantry and a sort of anti-tank style mode, but it actually turns out to be 3 direct upgrades on the same firing profile, depending on how much you want to risk and push your luck by overcharging it. The base profile for the gun, which you can fire with no risk at all, is half charge. That's just 12-inch range, 3 shots hitting on a 2, a strength 8, AP 1, damage 1, with rapid fire 1. So I guess if you're within 6 inches, that's 4 shots. That seems very weak indeed and probably not worth bothering with so much, unless you want literally no chance of him dying this turn because he's trying to do something else important. Then he basically had 2 different levels of overcharge, and for each one of those you get an extra 6-inch range, an extra pip of AP, an extra pip of damage, and an extra +1 to that rapid fire. That means if you go to full charge, you gain the hazardous keyword, but you then have an 18-inch range gun with strength 8, AP 2, damage 2, and rapid fire 2. So that's basically turned it into quite a good space marine killing style weapon, and it'd be up to 5 attacks at 9-inch range. So overall feels fairly punchy at destroying medium infantry. The real value for this guy looks like it's in the overcharge one though, which really takes it next level. This one now cranks it up to 24-inch range, 3 shots at strength 8, AP 3 and damage 3, so now being really quite a serious threat to Terminators, and enough that you might sneak some meaningful damage through against monsters or vehicles with a good roll, and the rapid fire becomes far more meaningful, getting 6 shots at 12 inches, which feels a lot more achievable and worthwhile than say 4 at 6 inches. The big trade-off with this one though is that the overcharge now means that you've got a really good chance of triggering hazardous. It basically means that when you roll the hazardous dice on a 1, 2 or 3, he takes the 3 mortal wounds that you get from that. So basically half the time he's literally starting to cook himself with his own overcharged cannon. It obviously depends on his points cost, though I feel like it is going to be worth it to hit that overcharge profile against the right target, like some Terminators. I feel like you've got a pretty reasonable chance of justifying his existence in a single round of shooting. Could be pretty punchy to have him jumping out of a transport, perhaps particularly if the Hecaton Land Fortress still allows you to re-roll some wound rolls with that. One thing they haven't shown off though is how many wounds he has. The Leagues of Votann characters so far have generally had 4, though if he's just a cheap support character he might just have the 3. If hitting overcharge gives you a 50-50 chance of losing the model, then that could be a really big deal. Though if he has 4 wounds, then at least you can guarantee that he lives through one use of his gun even if it goes badly. And he could always think about command point re-rolling the hazardous if it made sense to. Overall though, certainly looks punchy enough to be worth it for a lone character. Obviously everything's going to depend on his points cost. If he can jump out of a transport and kill his points in a single round of shooting, then I'm sure he'd be a fairly popular model. If he costs too much for that, then I guess not. And I guess whether or not he's going to one-shot himself with a hazardous roll is quite a big deal too. Next up, we've got the Memnyr Strategist. Previously we knew that he could lead the Ironkin Steeljacks, and we already had a good idea of his 2 special rules. They said he can manipulate yield points while on objectives, though until yesterday we didn't know what they did, and he allows either a free heroic intervention or overwatch for his unit. The rule that they unveiled for him today is Computational Mastermind, and that's the yield point one. Basically for each objective marker that your army controls that has a model with this rule on it, you can choose to raise or lower your yield score by 1 just before you determine your army rule. So that means that if you're around about the 7 yield point kind of mark, you could use one of these guys to lower it a bit if you wanted the hostile aggressive one for pushing onto objectives, or if you wanted the fortify one for the defense buff and the damage boost when you're controlling objectives, then you could maybe bump it up a bit. Seems like nice enough manipulation for the faction mechanic. If they're cheap enough, you could literally have one of these sat on the home field objective to help that each turn. I guess if you want additional value from him, you could have some ranged Steeljacks shooting out with their free overwatch. I guess generating yield points could be handy enough for any detachments that want to spend lots of them as well. The boosted versions of the stratagems from the Need Guard Oathband, they look like they'd be very yield point hungry, so maybe could make a bit more sense in detachments like that. Next up, we had some rules for the Ironkin Steeljacks themselves, perhaps the only big mainline damage dealer style unit added this time around. For hints and teasers so far, we knew that they're very tough, kind of similar to Wraithguard, and they confirmed that they have a 2+ save. I'd probably guess 3 wounds at toughness 6, though could be different. They're very likely going to be in units of 3 or 6, given that they're a 3 model plastic kit, and they have a ranger melee unit, the ranged one with Vulcanite weapons, so probably around about the strength 5 or 6 mark at AP 0, damage 2 with devastating wounds. That's going by Volkite. Could certainly be less obvious than that though, and the melee ones have bolters they can use as pistols, and then swords or gauntlets to back them up. Otherwise they get a Premark crest, which means that critical hits versus units on objectives gain precision, so might just have a small chance to snipe out a key character. For this preview, they confirmed that they had 2 datasheets with different special rules. I had seen a few people mention this. I don't know if they'd said as much in the stream, but if they had, then I'd not really clocked any official confirmation. In any case, that explains the last unconfirmed extra datasheet out of the Votann's 21. I guess it's kind of a big deal. If you did want to field a lot of these guys, it means that if you can field units of 6 of both types, then you could field up to 36 Ironkin Steeljacks if you wanted a 4 Ironkin force. If you went for 3 maxed out units of the range and the melee ones, that'll also mean that their datasheet special rules will get 2 different ones rather than just sharing the same one. I'm not certain if the Premark crests might be the melee one special thing, or whether or not that's just going to be a common bit of war gear that both of the units get. But for this preview they showed off that the ranged ones get a boosted Overwatch special rule, Overwatching on a 5+ at base, and then that Overwatch gets boosted to a 4+ if they have the Fortified Takeover rule active. I feel like 5+ Overwatch rules are often a little bit on the mid kind of side, just because he still needs to expend command points, and it might still be a bit borderline as to whether or not they're really the units to Overwatch with, and that's presuming you're not saving command points for something different. It certainly seems at least interesting with the Memnyr Strategist giving you free Overwatch though. Seems like you could guarantee at least some fairly punchy damage in the enemy turn, and particularly if these guys spam out a lot of shots with devastating wounds, there's a pretty reasonable chance that you at least get something. It feels to me like that would make the Memnyr Strategist a more interesting unit for leading them, as it allow you to make good use of their special rule guilt-free. Otherwise, for the melee ones, they confirm they do indeed have auto pattern bolters, the same as the Hearthkin. They had teased that before. Sounds like these ones will be getting the pistol keyword, given that they're wielded as such. Next up, we've got the Cthonian Earthshakers. These ones are the sort of 2 model artillery pieces based on the old mole launchers, and basically a bigger and upscaled version of the mole grenade launcher that the Cthonian Berserks get. Seems likely compared with similar artillery units like say the Astra Militarum field ordnance batteries, there'll probably be 2 models per unit. I'd already mentioned they get 2 different ammo types, tremor or breacher shells. The preview that we got for these guys were the profiles for those weapons. The breacher shells only have 24-inch range, which means they're not going to be a really long-range artillery option. If you've got these guys camped in the home field, then I guess they'll just be threatening the mid-board objectives and not really much beyond that. As it goes, they seem fairly punchy though. 24 inches, d6+1 attacks, a ballistic skill of 5+, but with the heavy keyword. That'll still mean that they're hitting on a 5+ natively due to indirect fire against things that they can't see, but hitting at a fairly nice strength 10, AP -1 and damage 2. Quite nice to have a high strength and multi-damage on those. It means they should at least be some kind of threat to things like medium vehicles that want a bit of damage on them, or perhaps medium infantry models like enemy space marines, and they have the potential to get some good use out of the army special rule as well. A +1 to hit will have them hitting on a 4+, so quite good for hitting things on objectives in the early game, and then potentially if they're in range of the home objective, then they could just have a +1 to hit for the rest of the game once he gets to Fortified Takeover. As an alternative, they get some tremor shells. These ones get d6+4 attacks and a much longer range of 36 inches, so you're getting an average of say 7 or 8 attacks rather than say 4 or 5. These ones hit at strength 6, AP 1 and damage 1, so quite a good profile for clearing away various different varieties of chaff. Quite nice against guardsman profiles or chaos cultists or orc boys. Seems quite nice to have the option of the 2 there, given that indirect fire weapons are often trying to take down chaff units and objective grabbers. That can have a lot of value for the score, and maybe making more important enemy units have to sit around doing grunt work if they want any points. These profiles do rather imply that the Leagues of Votann will still have a base ballistic skill of a 4+. That did seem really quite likely to me though, given that they've got pretty easy access to army-wide +1s to hit from the core rule. I'm sure some people would like the kin to go to hitting on a 3 though. I suspect that's still going to be kept to elites like the Iron Hair Hearthguard. The one thing that we didn't see for these guys are any hints about their special rule. I'd probably guess it might be a similar sort of slower unit rule to the Cthonian Berserks, though with indirect fire they often have a bit of a disappointing habit of putting things like battle shock checks as their special rule, so fingers crossed they get something at least fairly good there. Given their indirect fire in 10th edition though, I probably wouldn't hold out much hope of these being massively strong. Games Workshop does seem to be deliberately keeping them niche this edition. Then finally we've got the Kapricus Vehicles. This one maybe felt like the least interesting of the previews, given that it didn't really give us much information, and we still got a fair few questions about these guys. We already know it's a dual build Ironkin kit with some front mounted autocannons for both of them. The transporter version's just for Jaeger squads, and it has another autocannon mounted on top. The Defender version doesn't have a transport capacity, but instead can mount some different guns, such as the Magna Rail cannon, and looks like it has a couple of grenade launchers either side as well. Unfortunately for this one, they didn't go into much details and just doubled down on talking about the transport rule for the Kapricus carrier version. And literally all this one gives us is the splitter unit style rule that we could have worked out already. It's got the transport capacity just for 5 Ironkin Jaegers, maybe not too unexpected given that they can't have any characters attached to them, or at least not as we know. And you do that prior to the game, so you could have 5 Jaegers in here, and then the other 5 presumably infiltrating towards the midboard. I guess it means that you wouldn't have any room for something like an extra Arkanyst Evaluator hitching a ride and then jumping out and dealing some shooty damage. Seems likely he'd be able to fit in a Sagittor though. It'd be interesting to see how the maths works out on this. For the vast majority of infiltrate units out there in 40k, it doesn't make sense to buy them a transport vehicle due to their main value being as infiltrators to seize the midboard from early in the game. I feel like this one isn't a place where it might be justified though, as it doesn't really cost you an infiltrate unit. It just means that your infiltrate unit is now a 5-man cheap expendable squad of Jaegers, which if anything seems more efficient, and this thing can follow up behind and push another 5-man unit into the midboard, something else for doing actions, holding objectives, or just being a general nuisance. If it's cheap enough, then that seems like it could be pretty interesting. In any case, certainly cool to see some new previews for the leagues. Let me know your thoughts on the new unit profiles. I feel like Buri Aegnirssen is looking like a bit of a beast in melee. The Arkanyst Evaluator at the right points cost looks like he's got an incredibly punchy gun, and I really hope that the Steeljacks are overall worth it from a damage and defensive point of view. It will be quite cool to have them as a viable frontline unit. I'll certainly look forward to talking about any more previews that we get about them later in the week, and reviewing the codex in 4 once that's out. As mentioned earlier, a big thank you to Baron of Dice for sponsoring this one. Feel free to check out their stuff, links down in the video description. They do have a huge range of faction-specific dice, usually at around about $35 or £28 shipping out from the USA, and that code Auspex gets a 5% off any order through them. You can check them out, links down in the video description if you'd like to take a look. I'll leave that there for now though. A massive thank you to you guys for listening. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you'd like to support Auspex Tactics and the videos that I make, feel free to check out the Patreon page linked down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.